There are some places that are very moving, because that's when we can say, here I'm sure that St. Paul stepped on these stones. And I can imagine that St. John too, who came later, and maybe Our Lady. In today's special, we're going to understand, after all, what or who were the beasts that Paul faced. Here in Ephesus, we're going to visit the ruins of the city, the stones where St. Paul walked, and the places where he preached. And in the end, well, you will hear the story of the day when the Apostle Paul faced a lion, and because of a friendship with it, was saved from death. If, as a man, I fought against beasts in Ephesus, what good is that to me? If the dead are not raised, do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. But someone will say, how will the dead be raised, and with what bodies will they come? Foolish one, what you sow is not made alive unless it dies first. Paul's furious complaint is against the Corinthians, the people of Corinth, a city that was about 500 kilometers from here, sailing across the Aegean Sea. It was a complaint against the unbelief of those who did not even believe in the resurrection of Christ, let alone in their own resurrection. And it shows the difficulty Paul had during his preaching to convince even the Christians. And this brings us here to Ephesus, where Paul himself tells us that he faced the beasts. We're going back now to around the year 50 AD approximately. When the Apostle Paul came here for the first time, he only preached in a synagogue that existed around here and then left. But what's important to note is that right after Paul left, a certain person came here, Apollos, who was a very well-known Christian at that time, an important preacher, came to preach in Ephesus and gained many followers around here. We don't have much information about this apostle. There is a lot written about him, but it's important to notice that Paul's disciples criticized Apollos, saying that his preaching was incomplete because he only taught the ritual of baptism for repentance, exactly as it was done by John the Baptist. While St. Paul, at that time just the Apostle Paul, had already developed a much more complex liturgy. Ephesus became a very important city for the Roman Empire because of its strategic location. It was right at the entrance to the Middle East. So the ships that came through the Mediterranean Sea, coming down from Europe or returning from the Middle East, necessarily passed through this point. This was a port city. All the tax money that the Romans collected in various cities throughout the Middle East also passed through here. And that made Ephesus a very wealthy city. It became an extremely important commercial and cultural center. It's no wonder there are 2 theaters right here, just at this spot where I am. And besides that, it was very wealthy, reaching about 250,000 inhabitants. Now, in the time of St. Paul, Ephesus was above all a sanctuary city. And the goddess they worshipped here was not a Christian one, it was Artemis. And in this city there was the largest temple in the world dedicated to her. In fact, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Archaeologists estimate that what we're seeing here is just a little over 15% of the ancient city of Ephesus. If we dig, if they excavate around here, they'll find a lot more things. But the reality is that the most important part has been found, which is the city center, the center of a Roman city, just like Roman cities used to be, with these marvelous columns, with their theaters, pagan temples. We're now going to visit a temple dedicated to Emperor Hadrian, who ruled the empire a little after the time of Jesus and the apostles, but who struck terror among the Jews and Christians. I stopped here in front of one of the wonders of Ephesus, one of the most beautiful works, very detailed, with incredibly rich sculptures. Well, first it's worth noting that at the entrance to the Temple of Hadrian, there's an image of the face of the goddess Tyche. She was so important to the Ephesians that when they said goodbye, they didn't say go with God, no, they said go with Tyche, Tyche. So important to the Ephesians. Which ended up at the entrance of the Temple of Hadrian, which also has in a second inner arch there an image of Medusa, the sea monster, the woman who was transformed into a monster, who had scales on her body, snakes coming out of her head, and the power to turn people into stone. A very feared monster. Hadrian was also a monster. Hadrian faced the Jews, the Bar Kokhba Jewish revolt, which happened between the years 132 and 136 AD, and killed approximately 680,000 Jews. It was such a massive revolt that it was practically the end of the Jews' attempts to fight against the oppression of the Roman Empire, and this greatly increased the Jewish diaspora. A similar revolt, which had an even worse consequence, happened in the year 70 when the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed, along with the destruction of Jerusalem as a whole. Flavius Josephus, the historian, estimates that more than 1 million people died in that revolt at the time when the Romans were led by General Titus, who was the son of Emperor Vespasian. Hadrian, 60 years later, suppressed yet another Jewish revolt, once again in a very, very violent way. And here in Ephesus, a temple dedicated to him. The good thing here in Ephesus is that we can sit on the ruins to admire the wonders of that time. This here is the library of Celsus. Depending on the estimate, it had between 12,000 and 15,000 books. When I say books, I mean scrolls, manuscripts. There was no printing press, everything was copied by hand and brought here. It became the second largest library in the world, second only to the Library of Alexandria. And it all started with a certain Celsus, who was a wealthy resident of this city and was buried here, exactly in this place. The population didn't want it to be just a tomb here. And there was a wish from Celsus for a library to be built, so Celsus's sons had this wonderful monument erected, which housed thousands of volumes of scrolls. Below, we see something very interesting right at the entrance. 4 female statues, but they are not women, nor are they goddesses. They are not representations of historical figures. They are allegorical personifications and symbolize Sophia, wisdom, arete, excellence or virtue, enoia, intelligence or thought, and episteme, knowledge. These qualities were attributed to Celsus himself, who was the important governor of the Roman province of Asia Minor in the 2nd century AD. And this library was built in his honor by his son Julius Aquila around 115 AD. The statues we're seeing today are replicas because the originals were kept in the museum in Vienna, Austria. And I don't even need much imagination to picture the philosophers of that time here, in this square where they used to come to discuss. Quite fitting, after reading, after studying or not, they would come here and talk about existence, talk about religion, about what was human, about what belonged to the universe. And everything happened in this space in front of the library. This structure we're seeing back here is very important to our history because it's an altar dedicated to the goddess Artemis, who was the reason this place was known as a sacred city. The devotees would leave here in a procession and head to the great temple, the marvel of the temple that was down there, which in fact was one of the most beautiful monuments in the world. So this was already a place of great devotion, and it is here that St. Paul arrived to present Christianity. And finally, we arrive at one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Temple of Artemis, over 100 meters long, 50 meters wide, with columns 18 meters high. A magnificent temple, sculptures of Artemis in gold, treasures, immense treasures, monumental architecture. But where is the temple of the goddess Artemis? When the Apostle Paul came here, it was precisely this devotion that bothered him so much. There is no more devotion to Artemis, and there is no more temple either. It was completely destroyed when the Goths passed through here in the year 262 AD, and they destroyed everything, and then there were still earthquakes afterwards. This here is all that's left of the temple of Artemis. Artemis was the Greek goddess of wildlife, hunting, vegetation, and she was also associated with fertility. Known by the Romans as Diana, by the way, there's a famous statue in the Louvre Museum in Paris in her honor, known as the Diana of Versailles. The Goths were a Germanic people from Eastern Europe, and they were raiding Roman cities, destroying everything in their path. And suddenly, they arrived here in Ephesus, found this wonder, and without thinking twice, stole everything inside. Gold statues, all the treasures of the temple of Artemis. The Goths stole them. Not satisfied, they destroyed everything, tore it all down. It's impossible to know if, in some way, a religious conflict led the Goths to destroy this place, but that wasn't the main reason. But in the case of the Apostle Paul, yes, when he came here, he almost died actually because of a religious conflict. When he wanted to preach against the goddess Artemis, a certain Demetrius, who was a manufacturer and merchant of objects related to the goddess Artemis, Demetrius didn't like Paul's preaching. Gentlemen, you know very well that from this trade we have our prosperity. And you are seeing and hearing that not only in Ephesus but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has convinced and turned away a great multitude, saying that the things we make with our hands are not God's. It's interesting to notice that Paul behaves here practically like a Jew. And he hasn't stopped being a Jew yet. He is still a Jew, even though he is a follower of Christ. Even though he is starting Christianity, he behaves like a Jew when he criticizes the making of statues. And Paul also takes the opportunity to use the argument that the rich and powerful are manipulating the people, and that the pagan religion only exists because of this manipulation. It's also a way he finds to gain new followers. These stands you're seeing here are from the great theater of Ephesus. They could hold about 25,000 people with perfect acoustics. The sound traveled throughout the entire theater. And according to the Acts of the Apostles, Paul wanted to come here to preach against the goddess Artemis. Remember, the goddess Artemis had a sanctuary right here. There was a huge temple. This whole city had a thriving trade that revolved around the goddess Artemis. And Paul's disciples first tried to stop him, but he seemed determined. He made a big speech and publicly railed against the goddess Artemis in front of all her devotees. Right below, a certain Demetrius was the one who exposed the Apostle Paul, and after he spoke, the crowd became furious with Paul. And not only is there a danger that our profession will fall into disrepute, but also that the very temple of the great goddess Artemis will be considered worthless. The majesty of her whom all Asia and the world worship might be destroyed. The people who heard that became furious. It was a crowd of devotees of the goddess Artemis, and they began to shout, "Great is the goddess of the Ephesians! Great is the goddess of the Ephesians!" And then a Jew named Alexander appeared, trying to calm the crowd with a speech that didn't really work. He was rejected, and finally a Roman authority came to calm everyone down. "Ephesians," said the authority. "Is there anyone here who doesn't know that Ephesus is the holy city of the great Artemis and her statue that fell from the sky in Acts of the Apostles?" The story ends well. Paul hugs the disciples and sets off on a journey to Macedonia. But there is another manuscript practically from the same period called the Apocryphal Acts of Paul, which says that he left here as a prisoner. Well, and it ends with that fantastic story about the lion that I mentioned at the beginning. That scene is said to have also happened here in the theater. As the Apocryphal Acts of Paul tell us, the apostle is said to have converted the wife of the proconsul Hieronymus, whose name was Artemilla, to the Christian faith, but in doing so, Paul would have required that the two remain celibate. And if we follow Paul's preaching, that actually makes sense. But this absurd request made the proconsul Hieronymus angry, and he ordered Paul to be arrested. And then, on the eve of Paul's execution, Artemilla went to visit him in prison. But miraculously, the two of them left and went to the seashore where Paul baptized Artemilla, and then he saved the woman from drowning. He returned to prison and the next day was thrown into the arena with a lion that looked like a giant. But the lion bowed before Paul and greeted him as if the two were brothers. After that, the manuscript says that the two were released. It's clearly a fable and is inspired by a well-known story from that time about Androcles and the lion, a fiction in which Androcles removes a thorn from the lion's paw. Then the two are thrown into a Roman arena, they meet there by chance, and the lion decides not to kill Androcles. Just as we are told happened to St. Paul. St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians is one of those we are almost certain was not written by him and was probably written by a disciple. But just the fact that there is a letter dedicated to the Ephesians, written by a disciple of Paul, already shows us the importance this place had in his life, especially during the final period of St. Paul's preaching, who after spending 3 years living here, continued on his final journey toward Rome, where he would end up killed at the whim of Emperor Nero. In any case, St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians says a lot about what the doctrine of that preacher was like, and about how he sought in his travels to bring non-Jews into the religion he was helping to build. Now in Christ Jesus, you who were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Christ is our peace. Of two peoples he made one. In his flesh he tore down the wall of separation, the hatred, abolished the law of commandments and precepts. He wanted from the Jew and the Gentile to create in himself a new man, establishing peace. He wanted to reconcile them with God in one body, through the cross. It was on it that Christ put hatred to death. Still hated by many Ephesians who were outraged by his preaching against the goddess Artemis, Paul left Ephesus never to return. But another follower of Christ came here and is said to have stayed until the day of his death. John, who tradition believes was the youngest of Jesus' apostles, built a great legacy here. According to one tradition, he even brought Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary is said to have lived in this little stone house until the end of her days. But was it really like that? Well, that's a topic for another episode. Our journey continues.